today I want to show you a few ways for adding harmony and generating unique melodic lines with the Cosmos module from Black Noise Modular. Of course, all the techniques will work also in hardware. And the first technique is generating a sequence by inverting an already existing sequence. So here, for example, I have a simple 8-step sequence. Right, this is going to the X input, and already we can get this sequence out of the respective output. Here we have the X output, right? Basically, this will just let the sequence through. But here down we have also the inverted version, the X inverted. Right, so basically now we get the inverted signal that we can use as a secondary sequence, again generating more melodic lines and maybe even harmony. So here I have two VCV VCOs, each of them is going through a bandpass filter, a modulated bandpass filter. Right, but in this case I have a 16-step sequence, and again this is going to the X input, so I can use once the original sequence. In my case I will use also a quantizer. Right, and then I can use also the inverted output to create again another melodic line. Right, so from one sequence we have now two sequences. I can also take the octave maybe of the second voice here an octave up, so they are more or less in the same range. Right, and of course on Cosmos we have two inputs, so this will work also with two sequences. In this case I'm using Ions from the geodesics, which has two outputs, two sequences. Right, so I have X and Y, and then the original outputs go to two voices, and then I have two more inverted outputs to two more voices. I have here 4 FM operators, so this will be one, another one, and then two more in stereo. Right, so from two sequences, from two simple 8-step sequences, we get now 4 sequences. This just needs a nice drone. I have here the VCO lab going through some chorus and a filter. A similar technique is using the sum and difference outputs. Basically, the sum output will sum both values and will average them. So here, for example, I have 2 volts. Here I have 4 volts, which is 6. The average is 3, as you can see here. And then again, 4 minus 2 is 2. The average is 1, but inverted. So we have -1. Here I have 3 and 7, which is 10. The average is 5, and then 7 minus 3 is 4. The average is 2 again, but inverted. And again, this will add movement and variation. Right, 2 sequences. So I have here 2 ADDR sequencers, and from the sum and difference outputs, right, we will get something related to these sequences, but a bit different that we can use with more voices. So here I have a few examples. I have here the original sequences, again 2 ADDR sequencers. In this case the sequences themselves are sequencing 2 FM operators. Right, and then I have the sum and the difference output sequencing 2 VCV VCOs going through a wave shaper. So we get harmony. We can also create like this a sort of a macro sequence, if you will. Here again I have 2 ADDR sequencers, 2 8-step sequencers, sequencing in this case kick all. Let me solo this for a second. Right, I'm using here the sum output, but again, since both sequences have 8 steps, we just get another 8-step sequence. But what we can do is I can shorten, for example, one sequence to have 7 steps, and then we'll have a longer sequence, a sort of a macro sequence. Right, the difference I'm using here with another voice, this is an oscillator from synthesizers.com. There are more interesting analog logic outputs, like for example the minimum and maximum. In this case I have a signal connected just in one input. This is an offset signal I can push up and down. So the second input is basically now 0 volts. So now we will get this signal only from the maximum output when it's above 0 volts. This will be the red trace on the scope. You can see it goes above 0 and we have the red trace, and when it's below 0 volts, the signal will come out of the minimum output. You see it switches to the yellow trace, which is the minimum here. Right, so again, below 0, yellow trace, above 0, maximum, red trace. And of course, we can also offset the second channel to something different than 0 volts, right? So here I have another offset signal, and I'm going to set this to, let's say, about 2 volts, 1.8, right? So now whenever it's above 1.8, we have the red trace, or the maximum. Below 1.8, in this case, will be yellow, right? So you can see we have yellow, 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 even if it's above 0, because now we have the offset at about 1.8. When it goes above it, we have the maximum output. Right, so this can be great for something like splitting a sequence to multiple voices. Here I have a sequence with slips, right? But I have 2 voices. I have the FM operator once with one part of the sequence. This will be with the maximum. Right, so this is one part of the sequence, and the second part, the minimum, will play dark energy. Right, and of course also here in the lower section we get, right, the inverted outputs as we've seen before. So here we have, for example, the inverted maximum that I'm using with another voice, in this case the VCO unit going through a bandpass filter, some delay. So again, from one sequence we got now 3 different sequences. We split the sequence to minimum and maximum, and we have also the inverted maximum as another version related to the sequences. And again, we can have also 2 inputs, 2 signals interacting with one another. Here I have an 8-step sequence with the ADDR sequencer. This is sequencing the oscillator from synthesizer.com, filter, delay. I will solo this for a second. Right, so it sounds like this. But now I have here also an LFO with a slew LFO module, also from Black Noise. Right, that I'm going to use to this in the second input here, and this will interact with this sequence, pushing it up and down. Right, we can make this even slower a bit. Right, so we still get a sequence when it's above a certain point, because we are using here the maximum output, and then the LFO will kick in. I have also a simple bass here, the ORB-sec sequencing kick all. Another way of adding harmonies with the XOR output, we can even gate sequences with this output and add space to the sound. Here I have an 8-step sequence. This is the yellow trace on the scope, and this is here the XOR output. If I connect this to the scope, you can see we get for now nothing because it has to interact with the second channel. So if I hold here, and as long as I hold here the button in hardware, it will work the same. Right, you can see we get the inverted sequence. Again, if I let go, the sequence will stop. And if I hold it again, it will go through, but the inverted version. Right, and of course, we can also use a gate for this. We don't have to hold the button. So here I have a clock division of 4, for example. So this will gate this sequence for me. Right, now we can also use the inverted output to get actually the normal sequence, right? From the XOR output, we get the inverted sequence. But again, the lower part, we have the inverted version of the upper part. So by using the inverted XOR, this one here, right, we get the original signal. But again, gated. So as long as I hold this, you can see we get now the original sequence. When I let go, we get 0 volts. Right, so I have here, of course, a few examples. Here I have an 8-step sequence with the ADDR sequencer. Right, this is sequencing the VCO unit. Right, and again, I'm using here the XOR with another voice, and I'm gating it, in this case, with the clock division of 5. And by the way, this is not a clock module, right? This is just the Bay module from Venom teleporting the clock division I have here, just so there are no cables everywhere. So again, I'm using a clock division of 5, but the sequencer has 8 steps, so it will always grab different parts of the sequence. This is sequencing another VCO unit with a filter here. Right, again, gating the sequence. And again, we can also gate the original sequence by using the inverted XOR. Right, in this case, instead of using a clock division, I'm using a gate sequencer. This is the nibble sequencer from Count Modula. So this will gate the sequence, and again, I'm using the inverted output, which is in this case basically the original sequence. Right, so we have another melodic line gated with a gate sequencer in this case. And as always, we can also combine two signals, two sequences. In this case, I have again an 8-step sequence. This I'm using to sequence the VCO unit, sort of a bass sound. Right, but I also have here a 5-step sequence with another sequencer. This is going to the second input. Right, and again, I'm using the XOR, so they interact with one another, and we get a sort of a macro sequence. And of course, we can combine things and create unique melodic lines with something like a sequential switch. So here I have the VCO unit going through some delay, right? And two sequences going to Cosmos, an 8-step sequence and a 7-step sequence, and I can use a switch. In this case, will be the sequential switch from VCV to switch between different outputs and create longer sequences. So for example, I can use once the original X sequence, and then maybe the sum output, and then the original Y sequence, and also the difference. So we have 4 versions. Right, we get more variation, a longer melodic line, and overall more movement in the sequence. Right, here again I have an ADDR sequencer, in this case only with 5 steps, and I'm combining it with an LFO. Right, again, combining with different signals can also be interesting. And in this case, again, I'm using a switch to switch between different outputs. I have here the original X, the sum, and I have here also the XOR, the inverted XOR. Right, this is sequencing the oscillator from synthesizers.com. Let me solo this for a second. Right, so again, we get more variation. I have here another example. In this case, I'm combining a sequence, right, with a gate sequencer. This is the octet sequencer from Count Modula. Right, so instead of another pitch sequence, I'm using a gate sequencer, which will also change the results. Right, again, I'm using a switch, in this case just with two outputs. I have the original X and also the difference of them, so just two outputs. But to trigger the switch, I'm using another gate sequencer. This is Decima from CV Funk. So again, instead of using clocks, I'm using sequencers, gate sequencers, to run other sequencers. In this case, a switch. The voice itself is dark energy going through some delay. Right, this again just needs a nice bass drone. I'm mixing two VCO units with a filter from synthesizers.com, a bit of chorus. And you can see how many options we have for generating interesting melodic lines and even harmony with Cosmos. I hope you enjoyed this video. Cheers!